Welcome to Product AMA, your daily online Ask Me Anything. We started Product AMA to give those passionate or curious about product management a daily break, something to look forward to. The format is 1 hour in length, weekdays at 3 p.m. Eastern. The first 30 minutes will always be a guest and a featured topic. The last 30 minutes is devoted to you, the audience, to ask your questions.
So our topic today is about how to build a culture of experimentation. And joining us to explore that topic is James Costa, who's a group product manager at TWG, where he manages a team of 6 product managers working with, or I guess product people, maybe we'll find out more, but they're working with clients to build great software products. So James, thanks for joining us today. It's great to see you.
Thanks so much for having me, Lee. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. So I always like to start with a question about your journey to product management, because that helps people really understand where we're coming from. Because, you know, as we always say, product management's an accidental profession, and you come from all sorts of different places. But you've been a project manager, a content strategist, and then an entrepreneur when you founded Fuse. When did you start thinking about your role as a product manager, and how did you end up at TWG?
Man, that's such a tough question. I think about like the best product managers and their stories. I think it always comes from a sense of curiosity, a sense of being a bit of a tinkerer as well. I was certainly always that. I was always interested in seeing what you could do with web and what you could do with, building products that solved people's problems in a digital way. And through kind of like having those experiences of using those digital products myself, it was something that I'd always be fascinated in. So I played with design, I played with engineering, I played with content strategy to really understand the intersection of all these different skill sets and capabilities and how they could influence the way that someone experienced something digitally. So I was really lucky that, early on in that, I got to play around with a lot of different products. And in consulting, you certainly get that. I love the idea of being able to work and help people build businesses, help people build things that solve problems. And being able to start Fuse off the back of those capabilities and those experiences in, product or project management, being able to do the aspects of design and engineering that I had a background in was a fascinating experience. And over 9 years, got to build Fuse, got to build it up to 15 people, work on really complex subject matter and experiences from like legal and prop tech and fintech. And ultimately, the things that I found that started to build that like product acumen and those things that were like, yeah, this is something different. This isn't project management. It's not design. It's not engineering. There's something unique about this. Was definitely a point where we were working with companies and they were coming to us and asking questions about what should we build. It wasn't a situation where they were coming to us and telling us this is what we need. They were coming to us and saying, you've got a reputation of building these great products, so you certainly know what you're doing. Why don't you tell us what we should be thinking about? And at that point of my career, it became entirely liberating to have that exposure and opportunity to be able to do that. So certainly some of that business context of, running a consultancy for 9 years, running it, getting it to 15 people was a lot of that. Looking for those types of challenges, those challenges that we wanted for ourselves as well. And, for the last 2.5 years, I've been at TWG. It was kind of an inflection point in my own career of thinking about like, hey, what types of challenges do I want to work on? What type of challenges do I want to dig into? And product was definitely a big piece of that. So being able to come to TWG, be able to work on complex experiences with scale-ups and enterprise, be able to go from, having someone say they want to build something new and not knowing how to do it to delivering that, but also being able to foster the way that we do product, being able to manage product managers now, be able to really work on leveling up the bar of the way that we do things at TWG as we do all the time. So grateful for that experience and those experiences that I got over that time. But yeah, to your point, it's a winding journey and it's been one that I've been grateful to be on.
Nice. Yeah, I think, the more I talk to lots of other product managers about their journey, it really becomes evident that curiosity is a key part of it. and the aptitude for problem solving. But then people come from all kinds of different places, and it's that breadth of diverse experience that's actually pretty valuable, right? It's the old, the old humanist liberal arts student in me loves that, right? So give us a little more context around TWG and how product manager works there, and if it differs from the role that we assume in other product companies.
Yep, absolutely. So TWG at its core is a consultancy. Our product is frankly our people. It's something we focus on quite a bit. It's what we build, our culture and our process around. People are at the core of everything that we do. And similarly, people are at the core of the products that we build. And so product in like that building and tinkering thought process has always been a part of TWG's DNA. It's been something that over the course of the last 18 years, it's developed and gotten the reputation that it has off the back of that. But it's built off of this reputation that we have and these partnerships that we get to have with our clients, where again, in that same way that I started realizing product was this situation where I was being given these opportunities to think much more beyond the scope of just delivering a product or just delivering a set of requirements. It ended up that TWG has kind of followed that same path. Developed a reputation on building products and building them right, having a strong sense of willing and care about the experiences that we build, but then being able to leverage that for the type of strategy that we're able to do with our clients to help them figure out their path, figure out what they should do, how they should prioritize. Those are influential things that we can do, and something we're grateful for. So given that nuance, product managers at TWG end up being really adaptable. We work on everything from scale ups who are trying to figure out what foundations they need to be able to scale and grow at a reasonable pace while not sacrificing things like analytics and data, but also work with enterprise organizations who are trying to figure out what's next, trying to figure out new products, trying to figure out how to solve existing problems. We get to work on all sorts of different things, and our product managers need to be able to adapt context to context, type of project to type of project. But we're always looking to challenge assumptions. So we're not in that role of, we are in this unique world where, sometimes a client has a general sense of what they want to build, but they don't want us to just go and build something blindly. They want us to ask questions, challenge them with data, challenge them with our thoughts, our best practices that we've seen over time. So we're always looking for those opportunities to influence the way that we can, do work with our clients, but also influence the way that they do business fundamentally. And our product managers also have, pods of teams working with them. So designers, engineers, QA, research, all these incredible craftspeople that deliver incredible work. And again, because our product is our people, we hold a high bar for those capabilities. And so you get to really get at the heart of solving problems with technology in a meaningful way. You're not fighting for resourcing with other teams or anything like that. But because of the way that we work with our clients, we end up working in ways of having more influence and having more connection because we're working with leadership. We have money that is not staff or is not salaries that is coming out of a company's budget, and they've had to plan for. And so when we're working, they're paying attention. And that's a great thing for us because it means we can move pretty quick. It means we can work quickly with them, make decisions quickly, influence the way that they work because we have the right people at the table. But on the other side as well, some of the things our product managers need to be able to do is have defensible decision making. Every decision that we make needs to come from best practice. It needs to come from a sense of our knowledge and our experience and our reputation that we've developed over time. And that's something that's a challenge. It's something that takes time to develop, is that narrative, that story that we use from the different data points that we have, primary, secondary research, data that we have from the products as well. So there's lots of different challenges. Product managers need to be incredibly adaptable, but I think the biggest differences are, again, that point of influence, that ability that we have very quickly to be able to change things. There was an event that happened last year before the world ended with this COVID stuff, that our VP product, Tom, I think at a Product Go event, talked about how product management at a consultancy and specifically TWG is actually more like product than most product companies get to do. And I love that thought. We are challenged to work in all sorts of different contexts and all sorts of different problems. And we need to be able to adapt in that way. We're not focused on the same problem day in and day out. Not saying product people are, but some companies can be like that. And so that world that we live in, that adaptability that our product managers need is probably the biggest difference that I would say you see between us and a run-of-the-mill product company.
Interesting. Yeah, I think you mentioned that adaptability is really critical, and I'm assuming that your product managers or product team don't necessarily always have domain or deep domain expertise with a particular client, right? And so that kind of forces you to really do that discovery piece carefully and not make assumptions and be transparent in the decision making, right? Yeah, that's good.
Exactly.
That's cool, very cool. So just as a reminder to everybody that's online, this is at Product AMA, which means you can ask questions. So just a reminder, put your questions for James in the chat window there here on Zoom, and we'll get to them shortly. So let's talk about experimentation, James. That's what the topic is today. It's become an increasingly important strategy and process in lots of product environments. And I find that a lot of teams are really trying to figure out what works for them. There's not a sort of one size fits all. Has experimentation always been a part of TWG's culture, or was there something that led you to start working on that specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that given the nature of the work that we can sometimes end up doing, we build a lot of products and we know how to build a product really well. And we got to a certain point where, clients started launching products in market, but didn't really know how to do that in a successful way, what kind of habits they needed to be successful in market. And this has been something that TWG has been growing and developing in over the last few years. It's been something that we've invested a lot of time in, certainly over that time as well, in understanding the kind of habits that we see, the patterns that we need our clients to exhibit before we feel confident that they're going to be successful in market. We could do all the work of making sure that there's, product market fit. We can do all the research that we want. We can build a product in a scalable way, but getting something into market and influencing and experimenting on it in some way, there's something different about that. And so certainly this is something that is transcended through all the different capabilities and experiences we have as part of TWG within our studio. Engineering is a part of this, design's a part of this, product's a part of it. It's something that we think about often, because regardless of whether we have a product that's in market or not, it's important to think about the types of habits and foundations these products need that we're building, that we have ultimately a responsibility towards to make them successful in doing that. So coming into TWG 2.5 years ago, this was something that we had started thinking about of how do we influence this in some way? And through partnerships that we had started developing with leading analytics teams like Amplitude, Mixpanel, Segment, Heap, all that fun stuff, we started realizing there's a lot of these fundamental things that our clients are missing. And one of the ways that we can influence that in a major way is through our product team. And so we invested pretty heavily in leading and training our teams and showing them what it meant to do this work, to be experimental, to influence the way that our clients do work within the space and how to talk about it. And what we found is, and this is something from my experience, running Fuse, we primarily worked in the United States. And in the US, companies are inherently data-driven. When you work with a company in San Francisco or in the Valley, when you're making a decision, you bet your bottom dollar, if people say bet your bottom dollar, you bet your bottom dollar that they are asking you what data you're using to make that decision. And it's something that we wanted to see happen in Toronto a lot more, in Canada, and North America a lot more, and is something that ultimately takes a little bit of care of explaining and describing what it meant, because a lot of people's paradigms of what analytics is and what data is are framed in some way that may not be true anymore, framed in some way that maybe the old school way of doing things that doesn't work with the new ways that product teams need to be able to move and grow. And so a lot of the work that has been done within our team has been things like running an analytics bootcamp, taking our product team through it, and a few other leaders within our company through this thinking, helping to develop what this offering is. When we work with a client within this space, how do we offer them something that is uniquely crafted to what they need, whether they're a new product that's just getting to market, or one that's been in market for a really long time and needs to catch up in this area. But it's also been, developing a lot of the talking about it, making sure that, like, when we go to communities and we talk about this stuff, we are doing it in such a way that it is hopefully growing the way that all of us across Canada, across North America are thinking about this. Because ultimately, if that's happening, then when these different product teams come to us to get work done, to build things, when we talk to them about data, they're already bought in. They understand what we mean, and they can work with us to make sure that we have all the data that we need, make sure that we can help them figure out what data they need, and then we can ultimately build an even better experience because of it.
Nice. We're starting to get some questions in the chat, so thank you, everybody, and maybe we can turn to a couple of those. Let's see what's good here to start with. Well, there's quite a few. So Rhythm is asking, how do you ensure that the work you do is more product management and less project management?
Yeah, that's a great question. Especially when we think about consulting, clients often come to us and they, have some idea of what they want to do. They've had to advocate for this budget in some way, and in doing so, they've obviously had to advocate for some outcome as a part of whatever we build. And what we find that's helpful for us out of the gate is we have, again, I'm going to keep coming back to it, that reputation of doing this work for 18 years. We've worked with companies from the scale-ups, like, obviously like the FreshBooks, the Ecobees of the world, all the way to the enterprise. We get to work with Interac, RBC. We're working with companies that have done this work successfully, and ultimately, because of our influence on their ability to do so, we come with that to our project. So clients immediately turn, kind of their ears perk up to what we have to say and what our experiences are. But further to that, it's about developing that reputation on the ground, being able to deliver early and quickly and show that we know what we're talking about. Build that narrative, build that story, so that way when we're telling them, hey, this is the way that we think you should do things, it's also grounded in, hey, this is the way that your competitors are doing things, and this is where we see the markets going based on these factors. So a lot of the work that we have is through telling that story to kind of move it from the project management to the product management. But then even further to that, it's about teaching our clients in some way. So, a lot of our clients, the same way that we go out to communities, and we find that people are still learning what it means to be data driven. And frankly, everyone is, it doesn't matter what you say, but when we go to those teams, we want to make sure we educate them in some way about what these practices mean for them, what these trends, how we can apply them to the work that they're doing, so that, again, it's not just about the outcome or the deliverable, but it shows that we're holistically thinking about the environments that these products will live within. So I think that project to product management, there's sometimes like this fight between project and product management. I think they're both really important. And I want to be clear that really good product managers are really excellent project managers. They can't give up on that organization, those structures that project managers have and are really good at. So just to be clear, but at the same time, a lot of the work that we do to kind of bring it into the product context is that holistic understanding and holistic perspective that we bring to the work we do on a daily basis.
Nice. Thank you for that. So here's a question from Peter, who's asking, what do you include when you're proposing an experiment, and how does that relate to decision defensibility? So maybe give us some insight into how you talk to your clients about it.
Yeah, that's a great, wonderful question. I think the way that we look at experimentation depends on the type of team we're working with, how much experience they have with doing experimentation. But I think it always starts with some sort of hypothesis that is framed from data in some way. Ideally, it's triangulated between, say, market data, user research, as well as analytics and quantitative data. But we start with some form of hypothesis. We usually then rate it against a couple of different scales. There's usually a effort rating. So, if we were to solve this, what does the solution kind of look like? And what is the effort associated with that solution? The second thing might be something like, what kind of impact will it have? Is it large or is it small? And then another one that we start to look at is risk. How much risk is associated with this? How sure of a bet is this? And when we start thinking about it against those different axes, it becomes easier for us to also prioritize these experiments against each other. But also in some way, when we're bringing it to design, or we're bringing it back to research, or we're just bringing it directly to our engineers to get this work done, we can frame it with the sense of also what kind of constraints we're putting around this experiment. Oftentimes, like, experiments feel like they can get unwieldy. There's so many different things you can do. So people get like unfocused and unstructured. We try to bring a lot of structure to it. We try to, think about the ways that we can go from insight to an experiment, and make sure that in that translation, there are a lot of structures created to define clearly what we're trying to do, what we believe it'll do, and what kind of constraints we want to put around that exercise. A lot of this also comes from like having some of the basic habits in place. So we think about things like, what does data governance look at the company? What kind of structures do they have? Are they meeting in some sort of regular cadence to talk about insights that they're seeing in data? Again, whether it's analytics and in tools like Amplitude, or whether it's also in things like user research. And how do they talk about those insights? Is there a consistent cadence that can be brought up? And then further to that, how do your roadmaps get defined? So what kind of factors go into that? How can we influence that? How can we have those people who are in those regular cadence of insights be a part of those product roadmap decisions? So that way they can say, oh yeah, actually, you're making that decision right now and you're using it, and then having data support a decision that you've already made. But actually there is data here. And then slowly the conversation changes from being entirely gut-based to then saying, actually, I wonder what data has, and referring to that person in the room who's got those insights to tell them those insights. And again, at that point of like being able to have those influential advocates at that table when defining those roadmaps, it becomes easier to say, all right, cool. Here's the insight. Here's our hypothesis. Here's what the solution looks like: effort, risk, and the impact. Now, when we go and put all this stuff together, we have a constraint, we have an idea of what to look for, and we can make sure that that we can construct an experiment that comes back to something and isn't just another idea and just popcorn that it can sometimes turn into without those structures. Mm-hmm. Good question, Peter.
Yeah. I think it's so important to start with that question. What is our hypothesis and what is the question, right? And that really has to drive it, so that it's completely focused. You're right. That's great. Yeah, I want to come back around to some of the mechanics of that, how you design them and that sort of thing in a moment. But Karen's asking, what recommendations do you have for building in routine experimentation and or creativity sessions?
Yeah, great question. So again, every organization and how you do some of even those creativity sessions can be different, because some organizations are completely against experiments. So you have to like almost prove the value out of the gate and work with them to understand what that is. And that's where those like creative workshops and stuff can come from. So I love that idea of being able to do that. But ultimately, sometimes it gets roadblocked by, to the point of your first point, that velocity struggle. Like, how often are you shipping? what features are being currently worked on, and do people look at experiments as something that can fit in, or do they think of it as something that doesn't fit and needs to be planned months in advance, and then you kind of like lose some of the point. So frankly, sometimes we come into organizations and what we find is they're not shipping often enough. And often that's where a lot of it starts. They're shipping once a month, maybe that's okay, but sometimes they're shipping every 3 months, 6 months, and then experiments are really tough to get a part of things. So the first thing to solve is usually in that space. But then further to that, the same way that we think about, saving a percentage of our velocity towards bugs and maintenance, we should dedicate a specific set of our velocity within sprints, or, whether you're doing two-week sprints, whether you follow a waterfall methodology, or even if you follow different things like Basecamp's approach to the way that they structure projects that they kind of have been talking about, and Ryan's been talking about for Basecamp for quite a bit now. Regardless of how you structure that, how could we look at a percentage of that work being dedicated to experiments? Maybe it's one experiment that's being run per month, starting somewhere in some way, and making sure that people realize that experiments are very low lift. So you can show them that the effort is low, the impact is high, you have a hypothesis, an outcome, you can start doing that. So some of that part of it, of showing people what you mean by saying experiment, ends up coming from those workshops. So we love the idea of thinking about, if you have something like a North Star metric, some sort of strategic framework around how you look at your product and its performance, you can leverage aspects of that, or you can even leverage base aspects of things like David Clore's pirate metrics. And you can start saying, for our business, what questions do we have about retention? What questions do we have about acquisition? Starting to frame it just initially as like popcorn style questions. Sometimes you can even start with like something like Spotify, like a company that everyone knows about, completely takes you out of the mindset of your own organization, kind of creates a little bit more of that free will, I guess, and make people feel comfortable with the space that they're in and asking those questions, and then bringing it to their product. So again, going against those different aspects, what questions do you have? And then again, what kind of things might you try to answer those questions? What things might you hypothesize based on whatever assumptions, whatever data you have now, that might solve that problem, or solve or improve that part of the pirate metric, or that part of your North Star. And once you've kind of gotten a good start of like those questions, those starts of like hypotheses, ideas that you might roll with, then you can start thinking about how you pick out some of the best ones from that, and then again bring them to that that kind of framework that I referred to before: a hypothesis, kind of what the solution looks like, the impact, the risk, and the effort around it as well. And then once you have those for a few of those core ideas that people are rallying around, then you can figure out how they prioritize against your roadmap and all that fun stuff. So I know it's a bit of a nuanced question. Again, like the situation that your company is in certainly affects it. How often, again, they're shipping, how they structure their work, whether or not they've done experiments before, and how many advocates you have there. So you have to obviously adapt this to your framing, but I love the idea that you're thinking about those workshops, and hopefully some of those ideas can be useful to you to get those creative juices flowing and making people realize that experiments are something they can do. They aren't something you need like a ridiculous amount of time for, and are something that can have a massive impact on the experiences that you build for your customers.
Nice. Yeah, I think, and there's a couple of other questions relating to sort of velocity and cadence. So maybe we can build on that a little bit. And of course, you've just said that it depends on a lot on the environment and some of the sort of pre-existing conditions of the organization. But so Zeker, I guess, is asking that that we've heard of different cadences for experimentation depending on the team, anywhere from 3 to 15 per week as a goal. And I've even heard stories about, Google and Facebook and Amazon doing like several hundred. How many experiments per week have you seen, and should we set a goal for the number of experiments to aim for?
Yeah, for sure.
Question.
Yeah. Again, I think starting it from a number can sometimes be a tricky thing. Google has tons of different products that they're running experiments alongside. They've got their teams and, their data architecture structured in such a way that they can do that in a really quick and rapid paced environment. Other teams may not be able to do that speed because their products are smaller, their users are maybe less. And so they need to get to a point where, they've grown their company, they have more data to kind of defend the outcomes of those experiments. So I like to start with, if you're running a sprint, and it's, a sprint is 2 weeks, and at the end of the 2 weeks, you're shipping, you have one experiment as part of it. Start there, start small. And frankly, it's kind of like going to the gym. You're going to go say, just like I did, I'm working at home now. I can totally use one of these apps and work out 3 or 4 times a week. Well, it takes time to build that habit, to build that practice, that regimen in. And ultimately, while you set that bar, maybe starting with one per sprint, you can start raising it as you build momentum, as you build, that kind of experiment culture, that ease, that excitement around the data, excitement around those experiments that you're doing, and as you can prove out the value of it. So starting with one per sprint is usually a good start, and then again, adapting it from there. But again, experiments can be anything. Experiments can be an A/B split test. You could be changing color or copy. You could be adding a new feature or rolling out an idea of something that could be a feature that you could pretend that you're building just to see if you can generate some excitement around it. There's a ton of different experiments, and based on that effort, that's really what's going to define what you can accomplish within that amount of time, and what one experiment even looks like for you and your team. So I would say, again, framing it with those structures will really help you when you get to that point. And again, start small, build that reputation, build those kind of processes around it where people share their wins and losses, are excited about the next experiment, are sharing insights, and then ultimately all of those habits will grow, and you'll be able to do, maybe it's not the 15 or 20 or hundreds that Google might do, but you'll start building up that excitement for it for sure.
Yeah, no, I think there's no question that velocity for its own sake doesn't make much sense. But I think there is a sort of a notion about improving your velocity of experimentation over time. And primarily because, now we're seeing that competitive advantage doesn't just come from a differentiated product, but it also comes from the competency to learn faster than anybody else, right?
Yeah.
And so there is an aspect of increasing your velocity to do that. But of course, the counter side to that is that you're always struggling with scope, right? So to increase your velocity, to some extent, you have to decrease scope on each experiment, right? Yeah. So how can you talk about the challenge of keeping the scope small and being able to run more experiments? How do you guys handle that?
Well, I think one of the tricky parts is people often start an experiment with an idea of what they want to change as opposed to what they want to solve. And oftentimes when you start from that sense, you've sometimes thought of a new feature or something larger. But if you can move into this framework where you're approaching things from being able to understand the problem you're trying to solve, you can creatively ideate around that problem, and you can come up with different solutions that then again you can rank against the different aspects of effort, and then figure out, there's often points that people get where a leader gets excited about experimentation because they believe it means their team can run faster and do more things, and that leader then says, I want to build this new feature, and it's a lot of work, and what they're trying to do is something really simple that a copy change might be able to solve for, or maybe again being able to get a sense with some sort of experiment to see whether there's value in building that longer term feature can be a tricky thing. But ultimately, this all comes down to 3 things. There's process, people, and technology. So how can we change the processes to make sure there's structures there to be able to do this work, to structure it in the right way? How do we teach people about what being experiment driven looks like and is? How can we make sure that they celebrate wins and losses, feel like they can be empowered to do this work, but also not feel or not be positioned in such a way where they're thinking that they can now get large things done quicker. And then the last thing is technology. How do we enable our teams with, investing in the right architecture and technology to be able to run these experiments quickly? A lot of great teams will also start looking at different tools to enable this. So we think about things like Braze, Airship, Visual Website Optimizer. There's a ton of these different tools that, whether it's messaging or whether it's, help desk related stuff, or even if it's like the A/B split tests that you might do as a part of like visual aspects of your product. There are tools that allow you to do that without any engineering lift. So could you leverage those tools to also help you even move quicker? That's another thing to consider as you like go on this journey of experimenting, is, how with that last technology piece, can you help empower your teams to reduce the scope with giving them constraints that these tools offer for them. So lots of different things to think about, but oftentimes people are stuck in a specific paradigm of experiments. And so that's why we, again, come back to that training, making sure people understand what they're doing and what experimenting is intended to solve.
Yeah, I guess, and we sort of talked about it at the beginning, but the purpose of experimentation is really to reduce the risk of over investing in something that's not going to work, right? And so,
exactly.
So if you're not making major investments as you go and you're working iteratively anyway, then maybe there's not that much of a need for, sort of specific experiments. But, back when I started, and this is totally different environment, but, a release cycle was like 18 months.
Yeah.
So, and you just prayed to God that it was going to work when it got launched. So
yeah,
it was, it's obviously a different situation now, but, so we've got a couple of other good questions here. One from Yuting, who's asking, how do you determine the level of rigor needed for user research before it gets sent to development for building? Should we spend 4 weeks to get data for 2 weeks of dev time to build?
Yeah, that's a great question. We find that oftentimes the way that people look at research, it can be tricky as well, because sometimes we end up doing a lot more research than we need. We need to do some simple calls, some simple conversations, but we end up thinking about it as a large research exercise. Just to kind of elaborate on that point for a second, we've been working with RBC and one of their innovation programs, and we've been teaching them about design thinking, product strategy, helping them kind of change some of the paradigms within their own culture of the way that they approach product design, product development. So in this past season, one of the first questions that we had from folks when we presented, the Double Diamond, the kind of design council in the UK, human-centered design, kind of like the approach that we take to this work, was from someone who asked, well, if we do this, how much longer is it going to take? Is it worth it? Like, what does it do? I think more than anything else, it solves for risk. So I think when we consider the 2 weeks of designing for something or developing something, I should say, the question needs to be asked as well, does this add risk from like a technical debt perspective? Are we, making changes that are going to be hard to pull back, or are they easy to pull back? Are we developing something that is in line with our product strategy, or is this something that's completely outside of it? So some of those questions obviously need to be answered. But on the other side, again, to my initial point, we need to think about the way that we structure these research activities. Are there ways that we can do it in a light touch way? Are there things that we can leverage as data points that are run parallel to actually doing user research, or can give us a sense of what users are feeling? Are there any trends that we're seeing in the market? We often see that as that secondary research potentially supporting a decision that we're making. Or again, that's where analytics falls in, being able to understand user behavior and being able to point at something and ask questions and start to form those hypotheses to then be able to design something. So I think, like, even if you were to frame that 2 week idea or that thing that you want to work on within the context of an experiment, because it is, it's a tight 2-week period. It's got a nice constraint around it if that's something that can sustainably be delivered within that time. What is the impact to it? What's the risk? You've defined the effort, but what does it solve for? And what will we be looking at for on the other side to see whether or not it's worked or not? Research can help us de-risk a little bit more, certainly, but if we feel like the risk is already pretty low, then let's empower our research teams to focus on bigger ticket things, empower them to focus on things that will help us identify pain points that we don't know exist, that even analytics won't tell us about, but might clue us to. And then again, we can put something into market, have that data set up so that we can see if it worked. And then again, if that technical data isn't going to be there, if it's easy to pull back, then we can run it as that experiment, put it out there for a week, see how people feel, and then pull it back if there is a problem. But oftentimes, again, we get people who, as part of our research practice, we believe in that idea of just enough research. Even as consultants, we don't believe in building massive decks and running a year of research to figure things out. How do we do just enough research? How do we figure out what we need and what we're trying to solve for with an experiment in the smallest way possible to de-risk things? So that way, when our engineers are doing that 2-week cycle, 4-week cycle, 18-month cycle, regardless of what it is, it's de-risked as much as we can.
Nice. That's very helpful, I think. We also have a couple of questions relating to experimentation or your approach to it in different kinds of environments, like B2B or B2C. Is there in your experience, is there some difference you might call out between how you approach it? Or this other question from Raghu, who's asking, is there a difference between product development companies versus an e-commerce company, for example, where a new product is often a new feature on a website, right?
Yep.
So are there some kind of fundamental best practices and foundational things that you would say apply in any environment, or where do there become significant differences?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. So I, first of all, would say that anytime your user is going to be different, it doesn't matter whether the product is, B2B versus B2C, or whether you're in fintech versus insurance. When your users are different, when what you're selling is different, what you do for experimentation, how you develop your strategy is going to be fundamentally different. And the best practices that you also pull from are going to be different. So while there are some core things, like again, the people, process, and technology that we think about to kind of build those habits within those organizations, ultimately, what the actual experiments look like tend to differ. So obviously on a retail product where you're selling a product, something off the shelf, you're going to have a very different strategy than you would if you're, improving retention within a mobile product that is consumer facing. So the strategies that you use will differ. Some of the tools might be similar though. Things like messaging. Messaging is different on retail fundamentally than it is in a product because you might not know who your user is. You can make guesses about who they are, but they haven't signed in, they haven't signed up. You don't know exactly much data on them. You might know where they're from and that kind of thing, but you have to infer certain things based on their behavior pretty quickly to drive personalization and change to the retail experience for them. Further, in a product, you have a little bit more on them. So you can try to push different things to them. And again, try to, over time, see how they react to one thing versus another. And this is like a cohort or a behavioral cohort of users that you're doing this with. So certainly, I think when you're looking at, or when we look at a company that is in that B2B space, there's often that initial pushback of, well, I'm working with a business. Does tracking retention really matter for my business? Because really, like, if I'm selling to another company and they're forced to use my software, retention isn't something that I'm driving towards. And I often say, like, yeah, a lot of those things may seem like they don't matter, but if you can show that people are using your product consistently and have depth of usage and are achieving certain outcomes with data, you can show that at renewal time. That's an impactful story to help you renew with that B2B client. And that's similar to, but different than the way that we look at it with B2C. If we know that someone is retained within a product, it is more likely in a B2C product that when it comes for that, that time that they're going to renew on a monthly basis, they will renew if they're using the product more often, because if they're using it, they obviously see value in it. So again, retention, a core concept, thinking about those tools that you use for experimentation, they are very similar, but what they look like, what data you have on your users is fundamentally different, and what actions you're driving towards is fundamentally different. So it doesn't matter whether it's a different industry, a different product category, or anything like that. You're going to always have to adapt what experimentation does. So we love looking at examples of different companies and case studies from our own experience of clients that we've worked with, but also ones that we know have been successful with certain experimentation strategies market. But it doesn't mean that if Facebook did something and if you're in a social space, it'll still work for you. You got to take the lens of who your users are and what they're trying to accomplish, to heart when you're making those decisions. And if you're not, then, those experiments are just going to be trying to catch up to competitors versus stay ahead of them. So start thinking about it in that way. But again, it's nuanced, but thinking about what you can pull, what you can understand, what tools you can leverage to help drive that experimentation can be an extremely valuable focus for teams who are trying to grow in this.
Cool. That's really helpful. Thanks. There's also, we have time for a couple more questions, but there's also a couple of questions around where people can learn more. Are there books or articles that you would point them to, or any particular training programs or courses? How would you suggest people get, more immersed in this?
Yeah, there's quite a few. So first one, I'll do a quick little plug. I can do a plug, right? That's okay. It won't be a sales plug, but I'm doing a workshop with Segment in 2 weeks from now. We're going to go through a workshop where we actually talk about experimentation in a deeper way. We're going to do a little bit of a workshop, some of those ideas that I talked about before of how you come up with experiments, how you define an experiment, and all that fun stuff. If you're interested in that, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to send you an invite to that. It's a small workshop, but happy to include people who are interested in this work.
And what about books or
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So for that, Amplitude is actually a really great resource for this. They've invested quite a bit in thought leadership, and they have 3 playbooks that I recommend. There's a North Star playbook, which is great on developing an analytics strategy. There's a retention playbook, which is great on talking about the advanced look at what retention actually means. People often track it as the base chart that you get with any analytics tool, but there's so much more nuance to it. Thinking about your frequency of usage, the action or activation step that a user goes through that you're tracking to make sure that they're not just logging in, but they're actually seeing value with every usage of your product. And then further to that, how you can apply that to different business types as well as different industries. They also have one on engagement that I think is great for, again, thinking about the depth to which users use our products. In terms of training beyond that, I actually, have seen a lot of people come out with a ton of great experience from a lot of one-off workshops. I know Mind the Product's done a couple of them. I know that there are things obviously within the US. Reforge is absolutely an incredible program for people who are interested in exploring growth in a lot of depth. A ton of people who have come out of that program have spoken wonders about it to me. So it's an expensive program, but it's a really interesting one, and they have lots of different tailored aspects to it for what you're looking to do. So I'd say those are a couple of good places to start, but really just getting involved in different communities as well. People are talking about data, read those articles, catch up on this stuff. The more that you surround yourself by the people who are talking about it, the more you'll find those topics, those articles, those books that are the right ones for you in the specific situation you're in.
That's great. That's great. That's really helpful. Yeah. So just a reminder to everybody to, connect with James on LinkedIn, or maybe we can include some of the links to some of that stuff in our follow-up Twitter feed posts.
Happy to.
Yeah. So maybe one or two more quick questions. MJ is asking whether you could walk us through an example of a time you improved a project with experimentation. And there's bonus on this question if your client was in the enterprise stage. But keep it short. But can you think of something, that where, an experiment, relatively simple, actually changed your paradigm about the solution?
Yeah, for sure. I think some of the work we end up doing with enterprise clients ends up being the insights that we can help them understand that ultimately change the way that they look at their business and the way that they prioritize things. So a lot of like the big value stuff that we see with running experiments with the enterprise is actually helping them understand their users' behavior. So when we work with a big fintech company, we're helping them understand the way that something like a broker might actually engage on a regular basis with their customers. And in doing so, and in understanding what brings people back into the platform, we can then tell them about the areas that we want to experiment on. So, in a case of an enterprise, an example of kind of what we've looked at has typically been finding areas where people are actually stopping within the experiment, stopping within the experience, I should say, and then researching that, trying to understand what's going on, what's blocking someone from taking that next step, and then helping them redesign a particular part of the experience. And so that is kind of like out of the realm of experiments at that stage, but is still something that I think is beneficial. When it comes to a lot of our enterprise clients, it becomes difficult to actually talk about some of the specific things and instances. But when we've worked within like the loyalty space, we're constantly working on improving a mobile app experience for one of our clients. And in doing so, a lot of the things that we're trying to make sure we advocate for are making sure that our web and mobile experiences are fundamentally different, because the user's usage on each of those platforms are fundamentally different. So it's about giving that insight, but then it's also being able to show the behaviors of users on these platforms, so that way we can say and advocate for specific features being used over others. When we've worked with startups and scale-ups, the experiments can usually be things like notifications. So setting a notification at a specific point in a user's process and telling them about a feature that we find sometimes they may have missed or may not have had as much experience using. So we've seen upwards trajectory of an experiment that might take us only a couple of weeks to work on, of like 10 to 15% of retention for those people who engage with that experiment. So again, how can we use messaging for something like that? Or how can we even think about the content, the copy that leads people towards particular actions? And so again, even in changing copy, we've started to see some fundamental difference and change in the way that users interact with our products in some way as well. So I'm sorry, there's a couple of like intangible examples there. Can't always share client and the specific thing that we changed, unfortunately, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense. And often, again, with enterprise, it's usually about teaching them like, what are they really, how are people really using their product? What behaviors lead to power users? And using that to influence the types of priority that they set to the work that we do and the experiments that they let us do as well.
Cool, that's great. Thank you for that. We just have a couple minutes left, and there's one more interesting question here from Daniel, who's talking about in more legacy organizations that tend to be more risk averse and may lack incentives to risk or to take risks. Where would you recommend starting to build a culture of experimentation? He's saying, where is the starting point?
Yeah, for some companies, we show them it as what's the risk to not experimenting. So often we'll show them what their competitors are doing. We'll show them, the new hot thing on the market. What kind of behaviors are they exhibiting in the market? What kind of changes, tools, what's their cadence to delivery as well? And usually that'll scare enough of the leadership into saying, oh yeah, we need to invest in this or else we're going to lose our market position. So what I would say with a lot of those legacy organizations, it's often that they've never been a part of a process like this, or they don't understand. And so in some way of kind of starting to introduce this to them, what we've done quite a bit of within enterprise organizations, scale-ups, is actually come in to do a free lunch and learn and talk to them about what product analytics is and what running experiments is. And honestly, it's a good opportunity for us to be able to share this information, so that way, hopefully, it can change some part of the way that the business does something. So maybe you can do that for your team as an evangelist. Run a lunch and learn, start getting some advocacy around things, start building that excitement, and start sharing that understanding. And then once you've got that, include people in the process. You know, make sure you run the creative workshop to ideate on different hypotheses, different experiments that you could run, and then take back those ideas, put them into the process, advocate for them to be part of the roadmap, and then show that those were successful or unsuccessful in what you learned from it. So that way you can kind of build up momentum towards future experiments being done. So often it's about changing culture within organizations. And there's this wonderful like metaphor of like monkeys in a cage. 4 monkeys in a cage, there's bananas up top and a ladder and a water gun. Monkeys try to go up to get the bananas, and every time they get sprayed by water, they're not going to go up for those monkeys anymore. It's the same within our businesses. People have been incentivized towards specific structures and de-risking things for specific ways. How can we help them change those paradigms, understand the way that they're doing things, and how we can do it in a more effective manner? And yeah, maybe it's sometimes scaring them, telling them, hey, what's the risk of not doing this for our business? You know, what kind of customers are we going to lose? And what kind of position do we have in the market if we can't keep up? So some of those things could be useful tips and tricks to bring to those legacy folks.
Kind of that paradox, right? They're risk averse, but they don't recognize that experimentation is actually a way to reduce risk.
Exactly. So, yeah, try things out, put things out there quick. Yeah.
So we need to wrap up, but one quick last question, because I thought that last one was actually a great place to end on the culture, you know, the culture of experimentation. But Rhythm is asking, what's your favorite tool for experimentation? And it just a one-word answer, okay?
Oh man, Segment. I'm gonna say CDP tools like Segment. They changed the game.
Cool, that's great. James, this has been awesome. It's so nice to talk to you and see you, you know, plugging away in this strange time, and great to connect with the community. So thank you so much for contributing the time and joining us.
Follow Product AMA on Twitter and send us your topic suggestions. We look forward to seeing you soon.